Haunted Plantation House. A ghost story inspired by beloved James and Mary had been married for 10 years, and they had always been fascinated by ghost stories. It was their shared passion for the paranormal that had led them to the old plantation house, despite the warnings of the locals. As they climbed the hill, hand in hand, Mary couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement mixed with fear. She had always been intrigued by the idea of ghosts, but she had never actually encountered one before. James, on the other hand, was more skeptical. He believed that ghosts were just figments of the imagination, nothing more. But as they approached the old house, even he couldn't deny the eerie feeling that washed over him. The wind was picking up, causing the old timbers to creak and groan. James could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he refused to let his fear show. "We shouldn't be here," he said, trying to sound brave. Mary squeezed his hand. "It's okay," she said. "We'll just take a quick look around and then leave. No harm done." They pushed open the front door and stepped inside. The house was even more rundown than they had expected, with peeling wallpaper and cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. But there was something else, too, something that James couldn't quite put his finger on. It was a feeling of heaviness, like the weight of the past was pressing down on them. As they explored the old house, they discovered old photographs and letters, giving them a glimpse into the lives of the people who had once lived there. They learned about the slaveholder who had built the house and the countless men and women who had toiled under his whip. They read letters from slaves, begging for freedom and pleading for help. Mary felt her eyes welling up with tears as she read the heartbreaking words of the slaves. She knew that the history of the house was dark and painful, but she had never truly understood the extent of the cruelty that had taken place there. But as they delved deeper into the house, they began to feel as though they were not alone. It started with a faint whispering sound, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then they heard footsteps, coming from somewhere deep within the house. James tried to brush it off, telling Mary that it was probably just their imagination. But she knew that it was something more. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing up, and she could feel the presence of something otherworldly. And then, they heard the voice. It was a low, menacing growl, filled with anger and hatred. "You should not be here," the voice said. "This is my house. My land. You are trespassing." James and Mary froze, their eyes wide with terror. They tried to run, but the doors and windows were all locked, trapping them inside. And then they saw it, the ghostly figure of the slaveholder himself, his face twisted with rage. "You are all trespassers," he said. "You have no right to be here." James tried to reason with the ghost, telling him that they meant no harm. But the ghost was not interested in hearing their pleas. He was consumed with anger and bitterness, and he wanted revenge for the wrongs that had been committed against him and his people. Mary could feel the ghost's hatred like a physical force, and she knew that they needed to get out of the house before it was too late. She took James by the hand and pulled him towards the door, but it was no use. The ghost had locked them in, and there was no way out. As the ghost drew closer, Mary felt a surge of bravery that surprised even her. She stepped forward, her eyes locked onto the ghost, and spoke with a steady voice. "We're sorry," she said. "We didn't mean to trespass. We just wanted to see this old house. Please, let us go." The ghost regarded her for a moment, his eyes burning with anger. But then he seemed to soften, and his form became clearer. "I cannot let you go," he said. "But perhaps there is a way to atone for your trespassing." James and Mary exchanged a look, unsure of what the ghost meant. But then he continued. "There are spirits that roam this house, trapped here by the sins of the past," he said. "If you can help them find peace, then perhaps I will let you leave." James and Mary were hesitant, but they knew that they had no other choice. They agreed to help the ghost, and he led them deeper into the house. As they walked through the halls, they could feel the weight of the past all around them. They could sense the pain and suffering of the slaves who had been held captive in the house, and they could feel the anger and bitterness of the slaveholder who had once ruled over them. But they also sensed something else, something that gave them hope. They could sense the presence of other spirits, spirits who were trapped in the house but were not consumed by anger and bitterness. These were the spirits that the ghost had spoken of, and James and Mary knew that they needed to help them find peace. Their first encounter was with a young slave girl named Sarah. She had been taken from her family as a child and had grown up in the slaveholder's house, serving as a maid. She had died young, and her spirit had been trapped in the house ever since. James and Mary could feel her pain and sadness, and they knew that they needed to help her find peace. They spent hours talking to her, learning about her life and her hopes and dreams. They listened to her stories of the other slaves in the house, and they promised to help them find peace as well. As they spoke to Sarah, they could feel her spirit growing lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. And then, suddenly, she vanished, leaving behind a sense of peace and contentment. Encouraged by their success with Sarah, James and Mary continued to explore the house, seeking out other trapped spirits. They encountered a group of slaves who had been killed in a rebellion, their spirits consumed by rage and anger. But through patience and understanding, James and Mary were able to help them find peace as well. As they helped each trapped spirit find peace, James and Mary could feel the energy of the house changing. The heavy weight of the past was lifting, and they could sense the presence of other, more benevolent spirits, spirits who had been trapped in the house but were not consumed by anger and bitterness. Finally, they encountered the spirit of the slaveholder himself. He was no longer filled with anger and hatred, but with regret and sadness. "I have been trapped in this house for too long," he said. "But you have helped me see the error of my ways. I am ready to move on." And with that, the ghost of the slaveholder vanished, leaving James and Mary alone in the empty house. As they made their way out, they could feel the weight of the past lifting from their shoulders. They knew that they had done something important, something that had helped to ease the pain and suffering of those who had come before them. And as they drove away from the old plantation house, they knew that they would never forget the experience. It had changed them, in ways that they could not fully understand. But they knew that they had helped to bring peace to a place that had been consumed by darkness and despair. In the weeks that followed, James and Mary couldn't stop thinking about the old plantation house. They had been transformed by their experience there, and they knew that they needed to do something to honor the memories of those who had suffered within its walls. They decided to start a project to document the history of the house and the people who had lived there. They reached out to historians and researchers, digging through old archives and records to uncover the stories of the slaves who had been held captive there. They also started a charity to raise money for organizations that help to combat modern-day slavery and human trafficking. They knew that the legacy of slavery and oppression was still alive and well in the world, and they were determined to make a difference in whatever way they could. As they worked on their project, they received a surprising message. It was from the ghost of the slaveholder himself, who had somehow found a way to communicate with them. "Thank you," he said. "You have helped me find peace, and you have honored the memories of those who suffered in this house. I am grateful." James and Mary were stunned, but also grateful. They had never imagined that their experience in the old plantation house would lead to such a profound connection with the supernatural. In the months that followed, they continued to work on their project, pouring their hearts and souls into it. They wanted to make sure that the stories of the past were never forgotten, that the voices of the slaves who had suffered within the walls of the old house would be heard. And they knew that the ghost of the slaveholder was watching over them, grateful for the peace that they had brought to his restless spirit. They had come to the old plantation house seeking thrills and chills, but they had found something much deeper and more meaningful. As they looked back on their experience, James and Mary knew that they had been forever changed by it. They had learned that the past was never truly gone, that the memories of those who had suffered could still haunt the present. But they had also learned that there was hope, that even the most painful and tragic histories could be transformed through love and understanding. And they knew that they would carry that lesson with them for the rest of their lives.